Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. My name is Bill Benson. I have hosted the museum's First Person program since it began in 2000. Through these monthly conversations, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Irene Fogel Weiss share her individual personal account of the Holocaust with us today. Irene, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person today.
Thank you.
Irene, you have so much to share with us. Let's begin with you telling us about your family and your early life in Czechoslovakia.
Yes, so I come from a family of 6 children, ages about 7 to 17, a very busy family in a small village, a farming village, where the children were free to roam around and explore. My parents worked all the time because the upkeep of feeding and clothing the family, everything done by hand, no help from machines or stores. So they were busy and we didn't require a lot of attention. My father owned a small lumber yard in a neighboring village, and he left in the morning, came back. He was much more patient than our mother because he was not quite as exhausted, I imagine. And he helped us with our homework, and he taught us Hebrew. He also taught us how to read Hebrew. He was extremely kind and patient. And between this loving family, we were just a happy bunch of kids. We enjoyed school, we had lots of friends, and life was nice and normal.
Irene, tell us about this photograph, if you don't mind.
Yes, so this is the only one I have of my family, except the one that was taken in Auschwitz. So my mother here is 30 years old. I am the baby. This is 1930. She has 3 children. The little girl is Serena, who was about 4. She survived. The little boy is Moshe. He's about 2.5, 3. He did not survive. After this, my mother, from 1930 on, she has 3 more children who did not survive.
Yeah. Irene, as you said, you were in a small farming community. How large was the Jewish population in your community?
The Jewish population consisted of 10 families, lots of children, and mostly they were small merchants and craftsmen, tailors, shoemaker, small stores, rather poor.
Yeah.
It was not a wealthy Jewish community by any means. And
You,
we
you've,
lived quietly.
you've shared with me in the past that there really was no anti-Semitism at that time, from what you understand. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, there was no anti-Semitism. My father and his father grew up in the same place, the same house, and people knew him as a boy and then as a man. He was a very kind, patient person. He sold things for them from the lumber yard. They came to the house and talked about their orders, and it was just very pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
My mother would talk to the neighbors across the fence and do some, exchanging of produce. We had no feeling of anti-Semitism. Of course, it was understood that we went to the synagogue and they went to their church, and it was accepted.
Before we move on to the events of World War II and the Holocaust, I think we have one more family photo. Tell us about this one, if you don't mind, Irene.
Yes, so I am the one in the circle there.
Mm-hmm.
Next to me, my little sister Edith. She did not survive. Behind me is my sister Serena. She survived. The other young lady is a neighbor, a friend, and the little boy there in the middle is her brother. So basically, is my family, Serena, me, and Edith, and the little boy in the middle there also did not survive, but the young lady did.
Thank you, Irene. In early 1939, everything changed for you and your family when your community was occupied by Hungary, an ally of Nazi Germany, which immediately changed your lives. What happened once you were under Hungarian rule?
Yes, it did change immediately, although our neighbors and people in the town remained pretty much the same. But in the surrounding villages and the cities, the governments changed. There were fascists in charge of the government. They were imitating what the Germans did with exclusion of Jews in professions, in business, and also the hate speech on radio and in the newspapers. We were well aware that we were surrounded by hostility, mm-hmm. and we had to decide to lay low and not be out there, just in case.
You told me that your father lost his job. Will you say a little bit about that?
Yes, for a while he still kept it, but the restrictions escalated, and so there came a time when somebody else claimed the business, and it was officially handed over. And my father no longer went to his business; he was at home, and because it affected our income for the family, and also, the anxiety about this is a very big blow to confiscate your property and not knowing what the future has for us.
How were you able to make ends meet with your father having lost his job at that time?
Yes, well, I think the fact that we were in a farming town, mm-hmm. we also did have some land, but we, of course, never worked it ourselves. But because it was a farming town, my mother did have a very large vegetable garden. It wasn't just for the fun of it. She literally grew enough food to use in the kitchen. And what she didn't grow, she would barter with the neighbors. Mm-hmm. And so we were never hungry. The farmers who were not Jewish, the same way, they were, did not feel the war for a while as regards to food, but there was no income, there was no cash.
No cash. Irene, you also shared with me when I was interviewing you at the museum that you were with your father on a train and had a terrifically scary experience with your dad on that train. Will you say a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that was one of the ways that, hate against the Jews was escalating, that we were in danger in many situations. So I was coming home on the train with my father, a 5-minute ride, first stop after getting on the train. But immediately when the train started moving, there were a bunch of young teenage hoodlum types who recognized my father as being Jews because he had a small beard. Mm-hmm. And since, hate against Jews was now permissible, I thought they thought they would get away with, begin to taunt him and begin to talk among each other as to what should we do with this Jewish man? Wouldn't it be fun to throw him off the train? And they laughed and carried on and agreed with each other, and this kind of taunting and humiliation of my father continued. The people in the train did not say a word. No one stood up and said, "Stop it." But I was terrified because they were serious. And it would have been quite okay for them to do it without any, reaction from anybody else. My father and I both were looking out the window to see how close we were to home. And fortunately, it seemed like forever, but it was only a few minutes. And when the train stopped, we got off, and they did not have to carry out their plan of having fun with this Jewish person.
And that only happened because the train stopped and you were able to get off at that point.
Yes,
Yep.
if we had been on it longer, I have no doubt that they would have thrown him off. And I was already thinking, well, where are we? If they happen to throw him off now, will I go to the end? Will I have to walk back and see if I could find him? My mind was racing. What will I do if this actually happens? But the terror of such an experience to do that to my precious father, I mean, there's no way I can explain what I went through in the few minutes, and also my father. My father never rode the train again after that.
Irene, in 1942, your father, along with thousands of other Jewish men, were forced by the Hungarians to do forced labor for the military. Tell us about your father's mandatory forced labor service and what that meant for your family.
Yes. Well, as we were saying, anti-Semitism that was now allowed by the government proceeded. And especially the men were more humiliated and discriminated against than the women, because they were sort of more recognizable as being Jewish, the way they were dressed. So he was called in with all the other young men to forced labor. They were not considered soldiers. They were not given weapons, but they were taken to the front line and used in dangerous positions on the front line that exposed them to injury and death, because they were not respected as soldiers or trusted as soldiers.
In fact, one of the things that the Jewish forced laborers were to do that you shared with me, they were used as minesweepers, meaning literally walking out into fields to expose mines that the soldiers wouldn't have to walk onto.
Yes, they were doing the most dangerous work without any protection. And of course, many were killed. And in addition to that, since they did not have respect of the military, they were humiliated and they were used as slave labor.
Yeah.
So, our condition of not being considered citizens had its effect, that the law did not protect us.
Yeah. Do you recall, Irene, how your family coped with your father being gone to do the forced labor?
Yes, there was a great deal of anxiety. It wasn't just that he was gone; he was in hostile territory,
right,
as we were. It's very hard to explain if you've never experienced what it's like to be not recognized as a citizen, even if you were born there and parents were born there, and what it is like to be worried about people who will attack you, and the police stand by and don't stop it. So my mother was extremely worried whether he will come back at all, whether he'll, be injured, whether what they're doing to him, and will he come back? And in the meantime, the load of caring for the family and all the things that needed to be done fell on her alone. But it was mainly the fear and anxiety of not being treated as a human being and as a citizen.
Your father returned after 6 months. Do you know why he was allowed to return after that 6-month period?
Yes. Well, the Hungarian government attempted in fits and trying to not be as harsh as in their laws against the Jews as the Nazis were. Little by little, they became more and more harsh.
Mhm.
But at this point, there came a point where they sort of reevaluated these men who were called in to do this dangerous work on the front line. And since he was about 43, 42, and had 6 children, they decided to let him go home.
Mhm.
And so he appeared one day without much fanfare. He came home, and of course, we were all delighted. I know we children stared at him intently because they cut his beard, and we had never seen him without a beard.
Mhm.
So, we literally stared at him for a while till we got used to it. The family was very happy that he survived. He never talked about his experiences. He was
Mhm.
very quiet. But he came back in one piece, and we thought that we were safe. Thank
Irene, as difficult as life was for Jews under Hungarian rule, it turned out to be so much tragically worse in March 1944 when the Germans invaded Hungary. Tell us about that time and what happened to you and your family once the Germans were in power.
Yes, so Germany was an ally, but a year before the war was over, they realized that that Germany was losing the war, and they attempted to pull out of the alliance, and then Germany invaded Hungary. Now, this time, we understood that we were in big trouble
Mhm.
because the Hungarian government, if they wanted to be a little lenient here or there, were now unable to do that or unwilling to do that. But the Nazi Germany had a plan for Hungary the Jews of Hungary, as it did for every country in Europe that they occupied. And they were ready. We did not understand what their plan was, but they were ready. And within 2 weeks of their occupation, we were notified to leave our home and with one suitcase each and report to a gathering place. And they put all the Jews in our town and neighboring towns into a ghetto that was also readied. In other words, they were very well uh, prepared for this bureaucratic thing. And so suddenly we were out of our home. The entire family abandoned our home. We had some livestock. We had whatever accumulation of years. And I know that after we were out of there, our house was looted and we were taken away and gathered in a big city, into a place that was not prepared for human beings. There was no facilities of any kind. There was no sanitation. There was no running water. There was no kitchen. There was no hospital. And we had people in there, needs of everything: old people, sick people, babies. Everybody's thrown into one big place, and our a new living place was a corner on a floor. So the Germans, as I say, had a prepared plan. Before we left our home, a delegation from the officials of the town, the mayor, this was now the new mayor, and the police, and even our school principal, who was an official of the town, came to our house and told my father that he is to give them all his money and all his valuables. And they were harsh about it. They were not saying please. They said, we know you must have, and you are to give it to us. And I know that my father gave him some things, although we did not have
Mhm.
valuables as such. But they demanded whatever we did have.
So some of these people, like the school superintendent, are probably people that your father had known all his life.
Yes, yes. And they were just, since they were prominent people in the town, they used them for effect.
Yeah. In this place you were sent to a ghetto, which was in a very large brick factory in the town of Munkaj, I believe.
Yes.
And am I correct that that's also at that time you were forced to have your head shaved?
Well, they had rules in that place, all of them very harsh. And the transformation from being a citizen, a person, a free person and ahead of your family and living your free life and working, to being one of a mob of people that are considered subhuman, and no provisions made for us, and no respect of any kind. We were humiliated. We were hoarded together like animals. So this was a terrible shock to all of us, and things got worse from day to day. And they here too, they were having all kinds of humiliation and threats, especially to the men. And yes, the women, there were announcements constantly. There was an announcement about girls under 16 to report to have their hair cut. And I, without even telling my mother, I just went to that place, a tent in the middle of the place there, sat down and had my hair cut, because with every kind of order, there was a threat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you will be punished. Your father will be punished. It was always that. And when I heard your father would be punished if you don't do that, I certainly complied. When I came back to our place, my mother gave me a kerchief. I put it on my head, and from then on, my head was covered. We both looked sad. She looked at me and looked sad. But I remember that I really did not react like I would have in normal life when a 13-year-old's hair is cut.
Right.
I realized that we were, uh, that this is not the worst of our problem, and that
Right.
the hair will grow out.
In less than a 2-month period, a staggering number of Jews from across Hungary, nearly 440,000 people, were rounded up and deported to Auschwitz. You were in the Munkaj ghetto for 3 weeks when you and your family were deported. Tell us about leaving the ghetto and about your arrival at Auschwitz.
So what was always going on with terrible conditions that we were in, I know that the adults were always looking for some kind of explanation or hope that things are not as bad as they look. And so, since we were still in our country and not far from our home, their idea was, the talk was, that this is temporary and we will be sent home soon. This cannot be sustained. We did not imagine that the people in charge of us had plans made, and they knew exactly what comes next. This was a gathering place for the next transport. And so each time we were horrified what is happening to us. But being put in the trains that arrived there alongside the brick factory, announcements were made that get your things and hurry, line up and go, get in the train. There was a great deal, the orders were always harsh, urgent, and threatening. And so everybody was constantly on the double, doing whatever they asked us to do. And hurry, get in the train. And so we're literally marching, and alongside of us, the soldiers, and pushing the line fast. And so we managed, first of all, we wanted to be sure we all get into the same cattle car And so we're holding on, the children, to each other. And we're lucky we got into the same cattle car. But the idea that they're taking us elsewhere, again, is a terrifying feeling for my parents. I look back at what they must have felt, how we were being herded from this place to the next place. At this particular point, there was no rational explanation in our minds that there's something good about this. They were terrified.
Mhm. So you, of course, had no idea of the destination where you were going on that train,
Yes.
and it took you to Auschwitz. Tell us about your arrival at Auschwitz, Irene.
So yes, we were locked in, bolted from the outside, people sitting on the floor, and everybody wondering, what is our fate? And as the train speeded along, my father looked out and told the people that the train was turned towards Poland and that was our destination. And that definitely made everybody understand something they didn't want to understand. We heard about persecution of the Jews by Nazis in Poland. What we heard was that entire villages were marched out to the forest, and a firing squad would wait for them, and they would be literally mowed down, and that there would be synagogues filled with people, and that synagogues would be put on fire and everyone would be murdered. The reason we heard that is occasionally a young person would escape. There was one young woman who ended up in our village for a short time, and she told these things about what was going on, how the Jews in Poland were being murdered. And we all thought that this person was exaggerating and it could not possibly be so bad. But now that the train was heading towards Poland, the people reminded what they had heard and began to realize that this is a possibility. So I remember being great sadness, but total silence. No one spoke again in this moving train after that. It was absolute terror. And so eventually the train stopped and the doors were opened from the outside. My father looked out before we got out, and he said that he sees barracks and he sees prisoners in striped uniform, and suddenly their terror about arriving in the forest facing a firing squad melted away, and they began to rationalize again that there is some hope. That I remember adults saying that, well, if we have to work, if this is a labor camp, that's possible. We were relieved, absolutely relieved. But pretty soon, things changed. So we heard shouting and yelling to get out, and leave everything behind, and do it fast. And there were dogs and Nazi soldiers and people jumping out of the cattle cars, filling the entire platform, probably 2,000 people pouring out of this long train. And as soon as the shouting of out and leave everything behind and line up, and then more shouting about men line up to one side in a column and women and children to another column. And even as we were on the platform, the shouting continued to move. And
Irene, I want to draw our audience attention to this particular photograph. The museum has a remarkable and deeply disturbing collection of photographs called the Auschwitz Album. These photographs were taken by Nazi officials. It just so happens on the very day that your family arrived at Auschwitz. And this very personal photograph for you, we see you personally circled in this photograph. And we also have another photograph with we'll turn to in a minute, that's a closer view of you. Tell us about this picture, Irene.
Yes, so now we are out of the train. We can see the train there on the side, and the larger column is the men who are lined up. And I am in front there. My family had just reached the front of this column where we were faced by about 10 Nazi soldiers. One of them had a stick in his hand, and he was motioning people, separating people from one side to the other. And my mother and my two little brothers, who were about 9 and 7, were sent off to one side very quickly as soon as they appeared in the front. My older sister, Serena, who was 17, she was motioned to another side. And I was standing there with Edith, my younger sister, about 11, holding her hand. And very quickly, the stick came down between us, and she was motioned towards where our mother went. And I was motioned towards towards where my older sister went, Serena. But when my sister was so abruptly separated from me, and she disappeared in a very fast moving crowd, because the separation was crowds were sent to ones. If any woman was holding, any mother was holding children, and maybe some grandmothers too, any people like that, he did not even stop to examine who was in the group. It was such a group with children, the entire group was motioned. And so that while I was standing there for a second, horrified that my little sister was taken from me, large groups of people were going in that direction. And she joined this fast moving crowd. And I understood right away that she will not catch up with our mother. And I was just so frightened. What will happen to this little girl? And of course, as we were being separated, again, we had this feeling, and we had this assumption that this is being separated as though this is a work camp. Women and children will not work, they're separated. Men are separated, they will work, and young adults will work. But all of a sudden, if you take a young child alone and move her with the crowd without asking names or questions who you are, something is wrong here. They're not keeping track of the promise that we had thought we saw here. So I was absolutely terrified. I knew she was not going to catch up to our mother. So that's
Irene, of course, here we see a close-up of you from that picture that we were just looking at with the train and the large crowd. We have another photograph that's from that same collection, that same day, that is also intensely personal for you and incredibly painful. If you don't mind saying a little bit about this photograph for us.
Well, this is an incredible picture. And yes, the Nazis were taking photographs of this particular train and perhaps other trains, the arrival of the people. So these are my two little brothers, Ruvain and Gershon. Ruvain is about 9 and Gershon about 7. And with them is my mother, the profile there within the circle. She's sitting there with them. And the other people are women and children who came off this particular train. They're sitting here in a wooded area, resting, looking like resting. But what is happening here is that they are very near one of the gas chambers. And because of the huge influx of thousands of Hungarian Jews, the trains coming day and night, there was a backup in the gas chambers of the killing. 4 gas chambers could not keep up with the killing day and night. And so they are made to sit and wait for their turn when they are able to continue. to the gas chamber. Obviously, they too have no idea. People look very calm. Originally, they were told that they're going to go have a shower. And people are always trying to look for something that is bearable or at least familiar. And so these people are sitting there, all old people or people with women and children, and still have the same idea that it's a work camp and this group will not be working.
As I look at this photograph, Irene, and I look at your two brothers looking into the camera, thinking that somebody is just taking a photograph of them. So now you and your sister Serena have been selected for forced labor, for slave labor. You're together. You would actually remarkably run into two of your aunts, Aunt Rose and Aunt Peary, who had gone there ahead of you, and you were able to connect with them. Tell us the forced labor, the slave labor you were forced to do. You were sent to work in a part of Auschwitz that became known as Canada. Tell us what you had to do there with Serena and your aunts.
Yes, so my two aunts who were in their 20s, they arrived in Auschwitz the day before, and we just accidentally ran into them. They saved my life and my sister's life. I have no doubt about that, because I was terrified and I needed someone to cling to. We were first tattooed and selected about 1,000 women. We were tattooed on our arms and sent off to work in an area which became a storage area where the trucks brought the belongings of the people who came, from the train. And later on, we realized the belongings that came out of the gas chamber also was brought to this selection, to this area of storage. And we were assigned to bring all these things first into the barracks out of the weather and continue day and night shifts to sort out these belongings in a way that was consistent with what it was, like shoes with shoes, and pots and pans and blankets and baby carriages and books and everything people brought from all the many places that they thought would be useful. All of this had to be sorted in categories and prepared to be shipped to Germany for the use of the German population.
And what we see here in this particular photograph, Irene, right, is a mountain, a literal mountain of shoes. You couldn't even pretend to try to know how many pairs of shoes have been taken and put into this pile for you to sort. You, unfortunately, we don't have the time for you to tell us about the 8 months that you spent at Auschwitz, but you remained there under horrific circumstances for that period, 8 months. In January 1945, as Soviet troops were advancing, the Nazis evacuated Auschwitz. Tell us about the evacuation, about what happened to you and your sisters and aunt at that time. Where did you go?
Yes, so we heard noises of war, bombs and shooting. We heard that the front line was approaching, but we had no idea. We thought that we would all be destroyed, that the Nazis will not allow for the Russian army, to witness what was going on in Auschwitz with the gas chambers and the piles of bodies. And we were sure that we would be killed, absolutely. And so when there was an announcement that we should line up at the gate and that the camp is being evacuated, people began to wonder what it means. First, some people thought they should hide and stay because the war seems to be coming closer and it'll be over. But our little group decided that the gate is open, let's get out. Anybody who stays behind will be killed, the whole thing will be burned down. And so we lined up and exited in the winter of January 1945 out into the cold weather, and the huge column filled the highways and the sideways, and we were escorted by soldiers. Day and night, they pushed us on. People were exhausted. People were not ready for such exhaustion and exertion. We didn't have clothes and shoes properly. In other words, it was a death march. And after a while, people were falling by the wayside, and if anybody sat down or leaned on people, they were shot. And the side of the road was, and many dead people. It was literally not endurable, not survivable, this kind of exhaustion.
And you, remarkably, you were able to survive, and you ended up, after a series of different camps that you were forced to march to hundreds of kilometers, you ended up at a place called Neustadt Glaba, from where you were liberated. Say a little bit about your liberation from Neustadt Glaba.
Yes, so this march took many days, and we did arrive at this concentration camp, which was already filled with people, and there was no room for more. So we were jammed in, and the German soldiers and their people taking in charge of the concentration camps were also worried about their own safety. And so they were beginning to move on with a small crew of taking care of us. They actually abandoned us to a large degree. The system broke down. They stopped feeding us almost entirely, and we were starving. And in addition to that, we became infested with lice, and there was typhus in the camp, and people began to get sick. This camp did not have a gas chamber, but don't worry, they had a system. The killing and the selection of people who were sick or emaciated, they always had time to select those, and they had a truck coming almost daily from another camp that had a gas chamber. The truck would arrive, we recognized the truck, and they would select out the sick and the emaciated, put them on the truck, then off, and these people were killed. Truck turned around and came back. So after we were here for about 4.5 months, by the end, the starvation made us just totally like skin and bones. My sister was selected for the trip on the truck, and I was so scared of being alone, and I certainly was not in much better shape. I said, I'm her sister. And so I was told, well, you can go too. And so they put us into a room with many others who looked like skeletons. They locked the door, and we sat on the floor waiting for the truck to come. And after a full day, the truck didn't seem to arrive, and somebody must have opened the door from the outside. And somebody pushed the door and decided it was open, and we walked back to where we came from, into the barrack. And when we entered the room, the people there started to chant almost. The children came back. The children came back. It seems that they were mourning us, and they called us the children, which was a big surprise. We were never called children, because being called children meant that we were going to be killed. The children did not survive. The children were killed in these camps. but apparently they knew they looked like children. And so they were so happy to see us, and we were really rather surprised that anybody noticed that we were even missing.
And Irene, after that, of course, the Nazi guards had all run off, and you were left there and unsure, if they were going to come back, and ended up leaving the camp, walking out because there was nobody to stop you at that point as best you could. And that was your liberation. After the war, did you go back to your home? And if you did, who lived there and what did your neighbors say or do?
We wanted to know who survived. And we talked to some other survivors and looked at lists posted on walls about names of people who were searching and names of people who were announcing that they were alive. Eventually, after many months, about 6 months after, when we realized who the few people who were alive, and we gathered together in Czechoslovakia, I went back home with one of my young uncles, my mother's brother, went to my hometown and entered my house, and there was a family living there. It was the woman and children. She went over to one side when I entered. We didn't greet each other. She just pulled to the side. She seemed to know who I was, and I didn't know. We didn't know each other. I went through the house from room to room. There was nothing that was ours left in the house. I went around sort of a circle, came back out into the kitchen, and left the house, and went down into the garden. There was an orchard in the back, and I realized how long we were gone, because the fruit trees were full of fruit, ripe, ready to be picked, and I suddenly couldn't bear it any longer. No one in our house, nothing about what was in the house was ours, but here was the fruit that survived, waiting for us to pick it, and there was no one to pick it. And I began to cry. And the first time that I was able to cry. In Auschwitz, I never cried, and people around me never cried. We worked in this Canada place next to the gas chamber number 4, divided only by an electrified fence. We watched columns of women and children and elderly walk into that gate and disappear. And within a half hour or so, we would see the chimneys of the crematoriums belching not only smoke, but belching flames. And we had just seen these people. They had just talked to us a little bit. We just saw these little children in their mother's arms. And the flames were so high into the sky, and the flames were so strong, they made a noise like a wind. We saw this over and over, and tears did not come. We looked, and we even spoke about it. Why are we not crying? The trauma, the disbelief, the horror was so enormous that we were kind of frozen. We could not absorb it.
Irene, in the time the short time we have left, I want to ask one final question of you. But first, I want to show a photograph of you and your sister Serena when you arrived in the United States with the help of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, and this is 1947. So I wanted to make sure our audience saw this photograph of the two of you getting to the United States. Irene, my last question for you is, please tell us why, after listening to you relive the horrors and the tragedies that you've described, why do you continue to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust?
Well, with a greater awareness of this tragic history, plus the personal testimony, I hope that people are realizing, or have realized, that this tragic history cannot be repeated, and that they're learning from what they're hearing and seeing from testimony, that the hate and the discrimination and separation has to stop, and that I'm speaking because I hope that they understand that the tragedy that they're hearing about will make them be aware and stop this discrimination and hatred, which is even present in our time. So that, and then in addition to that, I am speaking for those, my family and thousands of others who perished and should be remembered, and I speak for them as well.
Irene, and you speak so eloquently, so movingly. You described as events that most of us can't even begin to imagine. We are grateful to you for doing this. I know everybody who's watching and hearing you today is not only profoundly moved, but I know they're grateful for you continuing to do this. So thank you for sharing with us for this past hour, Irene. It's just so, so important. Thank you.
Well, thank you for providing this opportunity to speak about this tragic history.